Dear brothers and sisters, my warmest welcome to our podcast, Creativity in Crisis. My name is Dr. Glenn T. Martin. For a number of years, I've been president of the World Constitution and Parliament Association, an organization working to address our planetary crises and to establish an enduring and liberating human future. I'm also a philosopher by profession who loves thinking, creative vision, and inspiring ideas. My newest book is called Design for a Living Planet, the Earth Constitution Solution. In these podcasts, I engage in dialogue with prominent thinkers, scholars, and activists who are similarly concerned about the multitude of crises facing humanity. Are there creative and practical solutions? I hope our listeners will stay with us and join us in these thought processes because they are a necessary part of our quest to create a decent planetary civilization for everyone. My Creativity and Crisis partner today is Dr. B. Sidney Smith. He's a retired college math teacher and a longtime political activist and leader with the Green Party of the United States. He has devoted the last 10 years in particular to analyzing the ongoing collapse of the industrial global order and its implications. He has written a number of essays and given numerous presentations on the subject, including his well-known presentation called How to Enjoy the End of the World. This presentation was first given to the Greens at Virginia Tech in Virginia in 2019. It has gotten nearly 100,000 views on YouTube. Welcome, Dr. B. Sidney Smith. Let us begin talking about crisis as you see it.
Sure. So we're a species in overshoot. Overshoot is when a species gets out of balance with its ecological environment, the system of which it's a part, and begins to destroy that system. It's a common thing to occur in nature. It happens all the time. Classic examples are when, for example, rabbits were introduced to Australia. They had no natural predators, and they began to multiply very, very rapidly and caused great ecological destruction. Australians have been fighting that for a long time. Mm-hmm. Any species that has no checks on its growth and has everything that it requires to grow will tend to go into overshoot ecologically. It's just a commonplace mechanism. Humans have been going into overshoot for the last several hundred years, and we really sort of passed the red line about 40 to 45 years ago, right around the early 70s, I would say. And that was the point at which we began using more planetary resources each year than the planet can regenerate each year. Mm-hmm. And so that began the enormous ecological decline that's now accelerated to the point where no one can even deny it anymore. And no matter how you look at it in terms of biodiversity loss, species decline, loss of ecosystem services, these are all consequences of our enormous ecological overshoot. So that's the ecological crisis.
I see. Yeah, and some thinkers include the so-called population explosion in that. Jeremy Rifkin, for example, says that even though estimates widely vary on what the carrying capacity of the Earth would be, mm-hmm. He estimates about 5 billion people, right? And mm-hmm. we passed that somewhere in the 70s, right?
Yes.
I remember when I graduated from high school in 1962, the Earth was at 3 billion people, and even then, a book came out at that time called Overshoot, right? Mm-hmm. Part of the overshoot was the number of people who all need resources, all produce waste, and so on. Right. Can the planet carry that many people?
That was William Catton's book, Overshoot,
That's
which
right.
is a very, very good book. And there were a number of people who noticed in the 70s what was going on. The Club of Rome published its famous Limits to Growth. Of course, there was a lot of talk about the so-called population bomb. Some of these addressed the situation holistically, as Catton did, and others focused on specific aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People who talk about crises also talk about the crises that have to do with economics. Mm-hmm. And of course, economics has been linked over and over again with the whole question of ecological decline.
Hmm.
Some economists have repeated the formula that you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet,
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
classical economics, even Karl Marx identified classical economics as implying infinite growth, limitless
Hmm.
growth, always
Hmm.
reinvesting for more accumulation of private wealth and so on.
Well, capitalism structurally is required to have growth in order for it to work.
Yes, yes, yeah, exactly. And so would you place that as a contributing factor, that the capitalist system that we've had for so many
Well,
centuries?
I would consider it an aspect of the crisis. The the crisis has many faces, and many mechanisms that are involved in it. When I think of the economy, I always draw a distinction between the financial economy and what is sometimes called the real economy, because they're not the same thing, right? The financial
Right,
economy is a socially constructed set of conventions about how we assign value and what rules we have around distribution of goods and services. But the real economy is, in fact, the movement of those goods and services. It really ultimately it comes down to energy because everything, goods and services are a form of embodied energy. And that's important because they're subject then to physical laws that we know about. Whereas the financial system is just kind of made up out of whole cloth, right? It's a sort
right.
of a fantasy. It's a destructive and dangerous fantasy, especially right at the moment.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it's interesting, just to interject, the real economy with the COVID crisis has been a disaster for people, right?
mhm, yes,
But the financial economy has not seriously been affected, right? The
right.
stocks have not collapsed and so on. It's like this strange juxtaposition between,
Well, you can do that when it's all just a big story that you're telling, and you can make it up as you go along, right?
yeah, I guess
People
it's
people think of money as being something that's real, but it's not. It's entirely imaginary. And what the central banks have been doing is down in their secret basements, they have these big vats where they loan money into existence, right? I mean, it
right,
really is just a kind of magic
right, right.
that has no bearing on the real world. And so, yeah, the asset bubble in the stock market and in real estate and in several other things can just get bigger and bigger and bigger because they're just putting more and more imaginary money into it. But it has nothing to do with the real economy.
Right. Good way of putting it.
Hmm.
Yeah, so you say that's a contributing factor to the environmental crisis.
Uh, Well, I think the economy is a self organizing thing, and it organizes around maximizing the use of energy and resources. And that's not just a matter of capitalism, that's sort of a matter of physics. That's why other organisms also go into overshoot. It comes down to a physical principle, or sometimes it's even called a physical law, called the principle of maximum entropy production. And what it boils down to is that if there's energy available, then systems will maximize their utilization of that energy if they can. This is how life itself forms ecosystems and other complex structures. And so around 1750, we started to exploit, because we had a new understanding of how to do it, we started to exploit an enormous energy source, 500,000,000 years of stored fossil sunlight, right?
Right.
And so the economy has been exploiting that energy source as fast as it can, because that's how systems work, right? That's what they do. It's not a matter of anybody's choices about it exactly. In the broad sense, in the narrow sense, it emerges from the individual choices of billions of human beings, right,
Right.
in their day-to-day activities. But in the broad sense, as a system, it just does what systems do. And so our economy has been exploiting that energy source, and that has been the primary driver both of our population growth and of our ecosystem destruction.
Yeah.
And now we've reached a crisis because the energy supply can no longer grow, it has to shrink. And it is shrinking. And one of the reasons the financial system has become so unmoored from the physical economy is the financial system has to pretend that growth is still occurring, right?
Yes,
Even
that's
when it
right.
isn't.
Yeah.
And in the real economy, growth has stopped. So at a certain point, that disconnect is going to result in an increasing number of more and more severe
Yeah.
crashes.
That's what Richard Heinberg talks about in his book, The End of Growth.
Mm-hmm.
which he wrote after the 2008 financial crisis, the housing crisis.
Right.
And he said more or less just what you've been saying, that at some point it's going to dawn on people that more debt, creating more debt, money as debt is just simply not viable, because
Right.
there's going to be no more expansion of resources or profit to even begin to pay for that debt or cover up its existence as a possibility of future repayment and
That's
so
right.
on.
Because debt is a claim on future growth in the economy.
Yeah,
And since there will be no real growth in the economy, that debt can never be paid.
right.
And so the system is going to break in a big way.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it's already broken. It's a dead man walking, but we're going to see some of the consequences. And, the sad thing is that the consequences for people, for real people, vary tremendously depending upon what kinds of privilege they enjoy.
right.
So, we're seeing it in many different ways this happening now around the world. We have tens of millions of people who are likely to starve to death in Africa in the next 12 months. We have millions of people in India who are dying of COVID when they didn't
Right.
necessarily need to. And at the same time, we have people who are using the system, even as it dies, to entrench their own privilege and power and their own great wealth. And again, this is nothing new in human society, but we're certainly seeing it in a big way right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The growth energy use came from, as you pointed out, fossil fuels. That would be
Mhm.
coal, oil, and gas
Right?
primarily.
Coal, a lot of coal.
Coal at first, right?
Hmm.
And today
Hmm.
it's oil and gas,
Well, I would point out that in China, it's still coal. I mean, they're importing a lot of oil, but China's enormous economic growth over the last 15 years has been
Yeah,
coal.
yeah, amazing. There are people who talk about, like Buckminster Fuller, for example, way back in 1972, was talking about the possibility of having a planetary grid, a solar grid, so
Hmm.
that clean energy hitting one side of the planet at any time could be transmitted to the dark side at any time, so that the entire world, if we were working together, he says, could power itself with clean energy. Even the new Biden administration is talking about converting from fossil
Hmm.
fuel to clean energy. They think that the conversion to clean energy will allow continued growth,
Right.
because once we get this unlimited source of energy coming from the sun and so on, the winds and the tides, there'll be no more impediment to growth. But
Hmm.
this seems to be leaving out a number of factors, right?
It is.
One
It's
one
it's
factor
it's a
that
fantasy.
they rarely mention, even the UN Sustainable Development Goals do not mention, is the one we mentioned before as population. Right? The UN Sustainable Development Goals say by 2030 we need to do these radical transformations in our way of living to a complete sustainability, which includes ending poverty and educating people and so on. And yet those goals, in the 15,000 word document that comprise those goals, they mention the world population only 5 times, and that is in innocuous context, right?
Hmm.
Never too many people on the planet and so
Hmm.
on.
Hmm.
Uh, I think it's the same with those people who think that unlimited clean solar energy could allow growth. It isn't just population; it's growth in use of resources. It's
That's right.
growth in use. There's lots of mind use resources like cadmium and so on that are limited. The scientists say we've passed peak exploitation of these, right? Doesn't mean that they've stopped, but it's declining every year, right? And fish in the oceans, for example, the peak fish harvest was way back in the 1980s, been declining ever since.
Hmm.
And access to unlimited clean energy is not going to solve our problems.
No,
How,
absolutely.
how do we address these problems then?
Well, I just want to point out three primary reasons why the idea that renewable energy is going to save this civilization, by that I mean industrial civilization, is a complete fantasy. The first reason is that the energy is renewable, but the means of harvesting it are not. There's a great writer by the name of Tim Watkins on a blog called Consciousness of Sheep. He's a British writer, and he addresses this very, very lucidly. He refers to renewable energy as non-renewable renewable energy harvesting technologies, making the point that the energy is renewable. It's going to keep coming no matter what. But the solar panels and windmills and so on and so forth that are needed to harvest that energy are made from non-renewable resources. And simply switching over to another way of exploiting those resources isn't going to end the crisis of resource depletion. We're going to be running out at present rates of use and growth in those rates of use. We'll run out of essential minerals like iron and copper and silver and other things needed to harvest sunlight within a generation, maybe two. So from the point of view of an iron forge, it doesn't matter whether that iron forge is being powered by coal or being powered by electricity. Now, the result is the same as far as the depletion of our iron resources, right? Makes no difference. So that's one reason. A second reason is that the amount of energy in sunlight is enormous, but it's not concentrated. People don't think about how extraordinary it is that you can carry in your hand in a plastic pail a gallon of gasoline weighs 6 pounds, and it will push your 2-ton vehicle down the road 30 miles in 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
The reason it will do that is because the energy density is enormous. There's an enormous amount of energy concentrated in a very small space that is easy to transport and easy to use. Sunlight isn't concentrated. We have to concentrate it before we can use it. And that changes the physics and engineering equation in very dramatic ways, right? So thinking that we're going to run the same industrial civilization on energy that isn't concentrated, that we have created using energy that is concentrated, simply makes no engineering or physical sense. That's not going to happen. And the third thing that really needs to be understood is that in order to feed the 8 billion of us who are here now, and however many billions are going to be here in 20 years, we need to be able to produce an enormous amount of food. And at the present time, our food supply system depends crucially on liquid fossil fuels for irrigation, for cultivation, for fertilizing, and for pest control. There's 9 calories of fossil energy in every calorie of food that we eat. And if you take away the liquid fuels, there is no way we're going to grow that food using an industrial system. You can grow it using old-fashioned, small-scale regenerative farming, but that's a different kind of civilization. That's not the civilization we have.
Right. Certainly not an expanding civilization.
No, and not the one we've got presently. So these are 3 reasons why it's critical people understand that this is, I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue renewable energy, we should. But we should not pretend that somehow we're going to have the same world in 30 years that we have today in terms of our rate of energy consumption. Our per capita rate of energy consumption is going to look a lot more like the 19th century than like the 20th century before we ever reach the end of the 21st century. And that's just a matter of reality. There's no getting around it.
So there are a number of initiatives that I've actually seen personally in India and so on, where people are creating sustainable plots of land, sustainable farms, and it's quite amazing the combination of plants and trees and the contour of the land to preserve every ounce of water that falls upon the land, all kinds of things working together to restore, not only use the soil effectively, but to restore it and to keep it healthy. Right?
This is one of the most hopeful things I think that's happening in the world, and it's happening all over the world. There's a large movement in the United States, regenerative agriculture, and the Green Party a couple of years ago changed its platform. It had been supporting so-called organic agriculture, which is actually an industrial form of agriculture, and replaced that with support for regenerative agriculture, small scale, localized, regenerative, right, bioregional, works with the ecosystem that's there. That's the future if we have one. And it's very encouraging that people are moving in this direction.
If we manage to survive the collapse and we manage to get our act together, well, we would hope, for example, that rather than a massive die-off, which most overshoot populations have experienced, right? But humans are self-conscious, which means that we might begin using birth control and education and understanding in the form of educating women and girls to the point where the population rate drops dramatically on the planet, and we could even begin contracting the population.
I think that to a certain extent, the cart is before the horse there. You're absolutely right that education, reproductive rights, these are critical components to stopping population growth where it is still tending to occur. But I think we're moving now into a situation where it's really a question of how we're going to manage the population decline. There are two ways this can go. The default way is for those who can to preserve their own way of life and let those who can't simply die. That's the default. The just way is for all of us to realize how integrated and how much we depend upon one another and to provide for people as the population declines. So, for example, big news item just this morning in the United States. Population declined last year at the fastest rate in the United States as regards the birth rate in over 100 years. We were at 2.1 children per woman as little as 20 years ago. We're down to 1.6 children per woman in 2020. That is not a rate of population. That's a rate of population decline that's actually fairly brisk. And that's the right thing to have happen. But of course, the article was about why this is a crisis. And the reason it's a crisis for the present system is because it means you have too many old people and not enough young people to pay for their pensions and retirements and Social Security, right? Not enough young workers, and they have to be taxed to death to allow all us old farts with the gray hair to live in the manner to which we've become accustomed. That assumes the continuation of the present system. If you accept population decline as a given, and it is, the population has to decline one way or another, then what you do is you say, well, how do we restructure the system so that it's just, so that those who are old will be cared for and those who are young will be able to build a world of the future, right? And those are the kinds of questions that I think have to be asked. And so, yes, educating women about birth control and reproductive rights and so on and so forth is important. But I think the larger question is, given that the population has to contract one way or another, how do we structure society to make that process a just one?
You must have ideas about how it's not just an abstract question. How would you do that?
Well, I mean, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? I think that if people can be, this is where education comes in, can be helped to understand that the best future for them and for their children is, as Pope Francis put it a couple of years ago, he said, the only future worth having includes all of us. The only future worth having includes all of us. The kind of lifeboat mentality of, oh, we're in crisis, I have to save my own and to hell with everybody else, isn't actually the way to produce a future that you'd want to live in.
Right.
To produce the kind of future you'd want to live in, you want to help the least advantaged among us, the least privileged, right? And make sure that everybody is okay, because when everybody is okay and taken care of, then we have the kind of peace and security that allows us to engage our creative powers to produce a future that is going to be a good one for children and grandchildren and for the planet, right? The lifeboat philosophy of, me and mine first and to hell with yours is the way we'd end up destroying the planet once and for all, especially with the potential for
would
global
you say
war.
that involves overcoming a militarized world of sovereign nations?
Absolutely. Yes. Militarization is the number one enemy of humanity at this time, and it is ascendant, right? It is growing. You can see that.
Yes, that's right.
Everywhere, and particularly in the new Biden administration, but around the world you can see it.
Yeah. So that's amazing. I think we've outlined a multi-dimensional crisis with possible directions for a solution and so on. Mm-hmm. And we've done it in the space of about 30 minutes, which is what I promised the listeners I would limit these to. So,
well, the devil's in the details.
So, what would you, how would you like to conclude for the listeners in terms of our conversation and so on?
Well, I don't have a lot of detailed answers about how the world should be run. And I don't think anyone does, partly because human civilization and human society isn't something you can just write a script for and say, okay, everybody do this, and think you're going to know what's happening, because it's a very dynamic, very complex system, and dynamical systems can't be scripted or predicted in that way. But what you can do is you can make positive changes. You can fight for justice. You can fight against exploitation and militarism. And you can exemplify in your own life and in your own outlook the way, the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of beliefs that you think will foster a positive human future. That's what I would always encourage people to do.
Okay, very good. Terrific. Okay, thanks so much, Sid. That was a great conversation.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it.
To our listeners, I hope you have enjoyed today's dialogue about establishing a living future for the Earth and for all future generations. Our podcast has been recorded, and the link will be streamed to multiple social media outlets and posted on my own website at oneworldrenaissance.com. I would love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this exciting conversation. You can email me at gmartin@earthconstitution.world. This podcast has been made in association with Everscope Multimedia. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and that you will join us in Creativity in Crisis at the same time and place next week. Goodbye for now, be well, and God bless.